In his seminal work on possession and exorcism, Hostage to the Devil, the late Malachi Martin, himself a Jesuit priest on numerous exorcisms, shared his thesis that an exorcism is the final rendezvous among the demon, the victim, and the exorcist, all of whom have been inextricably linked from before birth. Sometimes that exorcist is not a sanctioned one. Sometimes the exorcist is called to his ministry only when it is the last thing expected. Father Michael Maginot, a Catholic priest assigned as pastor of the St. Stephen Martyr Parish in Maryville, Indiana, was one of the latter. In 2012, he performed a series of exorcisms on a Gary woman named Latoya Ammons, the center of the now infamous case of the House of 200 Demons, known popularly as the Demon House. In the fall of 2011, Ammons, her mother Rose Campbell, and Latoya's 3 children moved into a small rental house on Carolina Street. The street is a sleepy street, at least for Gary, and the family was close-knit and seemingly well-adjusted, despite Latoya's status as a single mother trying, like so many, to make ends meet. By May, Latoya would have her children taken from her by Indiana's Department of Children's Services, citing, quote, severe spiritual stress resulting from what Latoya and numerous others believed was demonic possession. Latoya would go on to give her story to the Indy Star newspaper, specifically to a reporter named Marissa Kwiatkowski. The resulting article would become the most read in the Star's history, and the family's story, one of the most notable appearances of the paranormal in the American media, even leading the nation's most popular ghost hunter to purchase the family's former home, what became known as the Demon House. Latoya and her family had been in the house a month before strange events began, starting with the appearance of swarms of flies. Evocative of an earlier media horror, the Amityville horror, huge black horseflies suddenly infested their screened-in porch soon before Christmas, seemingly oblivious to the freezing temperatures. Latoya and her mother put down flypaper, swatted, and swept up the insects day after day, but the infestation persisted. Soon, one by one, other events ensued. On one occasion, a few minutes after midnight, Rosa and Latoya both said they heard the steady clump of footsteps climbing the basement stairs and the creak of the door opening between the lower floor and the kitchen. Fearing an intruder, the two waited with bated breath at their bedroom doors for many, many minutes, fearing even a move to call the police. After much time had passed, Latoya flicked on the lights and went to inspect the kitchen and the basement, but no one was there. Even after a thorough inspection and putting a lock on the door, the noises continued night after night, worsening with the sound of pounding on the door and sometimes the growling of what sounded like an animal. Rosa said that she woke one night and saw a shadowy figure of a man pacing back and forth in the living room. Fearing an intruder, she lay paralyzed in bed until morning and then went to investigate. Though the doors and windows were still locked from the inside, and though nothing seemed to be missing, the family found large, wet footprints on the living room floor. On March 10th, 2012, the family was awake late. There had been a death, and friends were over, chatting and reminiscing into the evening hours. During that night, Latoya's daughter complained of being pulled off the couch by an unseen force. Shortly after, one of the boys was thrown into a freezer adjacent to the living room. Later, sometime after the children had gone to bed, suddenly the conversation of the adults was interrupted by a piercing cry from the girl's bedroom, where she was sleeping with a cousin. When Rosa got to the room and switched on the light, she saw the body of her daughter drop to the bed as if from several feet over. According to the cousin, the girl had been levitating, still asleep. The visitors of that night never came back to the house on Carolina Street, and there were others who refused to enter the house, but for different reasons. The local churches, who Latoya and Rosa begged for help, turned a deaf ear to their pleas, believing the women were imagining or even fabricating their tales. Eventually, after an especially tearful visit to one small community church, a minister visited the house and declared that it was troubled by spirits. The recommended remedy he gave was a thorough cleansing with bleach and ammonia, followed by the inscribing of crosses on all of the doors and windows. Also prescribed was the anointing of the family members with oil. The first mention of demons in connection with the house on Carolina Street seems to have been when Latoya and her mother contacted two clairvoyants who sat the women down with news that the house was in. They said they detected more than 200 demonic spirits, that the forces were emanating from the basement, and that they must remove the children from the house at once. But with nowhere else to go, Latoya was forced to resort to Plan B. At the advice of one of the clairvoyants, she built a makeshift altar in the basement, covering a table with a sheet and placing on it a pure white candle and a statue of the Holy Family. Latoya, dressed in white and using a stick of sage from a local occult shop, went through the house with the burning stick, reading from Psalm 91, invoking God's protection. After blessing and smudging every room of the house with this occult ritualistic herb, she returned to the basement and placed the Bible on the rude altar she had built, open to the psalm she had been reciting. What followed was 3 days of peace, and then the real trouble began. Latoya went on record with the Indy Star claiming that demons then possessed not only her, but her 3 children, aged 12, 9, and 7. The possessions would come and go without warning, but there was no mistaking when they were happening. The children's eyes bulged and flared, accompanied by loveless smiling and gruff intonations of cryptic words and phrases. They felt lightheaded and besieged by an almost crippling fatigue. Headaches were a daily problem for nearly everyone in the house. Each child was targeted differently. The youngest began speaking of an imaginary friend who would coax him into the closet to play for hours on end, and who talked about knowing what it was like to be killed. Her 9-year-old once began speaking about what it feels like to be murdered. Her daughter, 12 years old, heard a disembodied voice tell her she would not live another 20 minutes, and that her family was going to be taken away. Latoya also claimed her family was physically attacked in the house, her daughter assaulted by a heavy headboard, battered so hard that she needed stitches, and her younger boy, she said, flew out of the bathroom as if by some tremendous force. The attacks became so bad that some nights, for relief, the family stayed in a hotel. With their spiritual remedies seemingly exhausted, Latoya and Rosa appealed to their family physician for help. The doctor told a reporter later that even he was scared when he first heard of the events in the Ammons home. But from the notes he wrote in the family's file, delusional, he wrote, hallucinations. He apparently was more afraid for their mental health than of any supernatural manifestations in their lives. Or perhaps he wanted it to appear that way officially. This would all change abruptly with a physical visit of the family to the doctor's office. According to the testimony of medical staff that appear in the DCS files, the 2 young boys began cursing the doctor in low and growling voices, the younger boy then being lifted and thrown against the office wall. Both boys then fainted, and someone called 911. A flurry of police officers arrived, no one quite sure what was going on. The boys were taken to a local hospital where staff literally laughed off Latoya's accounts of their troubles. When the boys woke up, the 9-year-old seemed himself, but the younger child had to be held down by 5 adult men. Someone, whether from the hospital or the doctor's office, called the Department of Children's Services to report the situation. Soon after, a caseworker arrived at the hospital to interview the family. An exam had found the children healthy and free of bruises or other marks. Latoya had been examined by a hospital psychiatrist and found to be stable. But while caseworkers interviewed the children, the 7-year-old began growling and baring his teeth. His eyes bulged and rolled back in his head. He then attempted to strangle his older brother and had to have his hands pried off his throat by the adults in the room. Suspecting that the children were for some reason performing at their mother's urging, the caseworker later brought them into an isolated exam room, joined by a nurse and his grandmother. According to the caseworker's report, which was backed up later by the nurse, the younger boy immediately began to growl again before telling his brother, "It's time to die." At the same time, the older boy began thrusting his head into his grandmother's stomach, at which point Rosa grabbed his hand and began to pray. Then, with a weird grin, the boy walked backwards several steps and up the wall to the ceiling, glided across the ceiling over his grandmother's head, and landed on his feet, never letting go of Rosa's hand. The caseworker later told a reporter that both she and the nurse ran out of the room in fear. She also told police that she thought an evil influence might be affecting the family. Though the youngest boy spent the night in the hospital with Latoya, the next day was his 8th birthday, and the family returned with cake and small gifts for him. After the makeshift party, DCS informed Latoya that her children were being taken away from her without a court order. The caseworker had written in the report that all of Latoya's children were under, quote, spiritual and emotional distress, end quote. Latoya was devastated. After all the family had fought through, the idea of her being suspected of abuse or neglect was too much to bear. The children, too, were hysterical over the idea of being separated from their mother, but nothing could be done. Incredibly, the family had been at the hospital long enough to catch the attention of the hospital chaplain, and on the morning of April 20th, 2012, he put in a call to Father Michael Maginot at St. Stephen Martyr Parish in nearby Merrillville, requesting something extraordinary, an exorcism for a young Gary boy. Though skeptical of the claims, Maginot agreed to visit the family after Mass that weekend, and on April 22nd, he arrived as promised at the house on Carolina Street. Maginot was a believer in demons, but also sensible and forthright. He told Latoya and Rosa that the first thing they needed to do was rule out any natural causes for what was happening. So for the next 2 hours, he listened as the two women laid out the history of the case in grim detail. During the interview, the bathroom light took to flickering on occasion, stopping each time the priest walked over to investigate. Blinds on the kitchen window swung back and forth as they talked, though no vents were nearby or any drafts detected. And wet footprints appeared on the living room rug. At one point, Latoya complained of a headache, prompting Father Maginot to place a crucifix against her forehead. Her body began to convulse uncontrollably. After a meticulous 4-hour interview, Maginot said he was convinced the family was being tormented by demons, but also that he believed there were ghosts, human, deceased entities in the house. He went from room to room, blessing each with holy water and reading passages from the Catholic house blessing ritual as he walked. As he stood to leave, he strongly encouraged Latoya and Rosa to leave the home. Less than a week later, however, the two women were back at the house to let the case manager check the condition of the home. The caseworker arrived with a police officer she'd asked to accompany her and 2 other officers who'd asked to come out of curiosity. The group went from room to room, inspecting first the main floor and its 3 bedrooms, living room and bath. The kitchen door, where the first sounds had started, led to the unfinished basement with concrete floors, and directly under the stairs, there was a dirt floor. The concrete around it was jagged, as though it had been broken. Latoya told police that the demons seemed to originate from that patch of dirt. One of the officers present was a Gary police captain, who went on record saying that he came to believe in demons after visiting the demon house. During that visit, an officer's audio recorder malfunctioned. The power light flashed to indicate the batteries were dying, even though the officer had placed fresh batteries in the recorder earlier that same day. Another officer recorded audio and, when he played it back later, heard an unknown voice. The officers also took photos of the house. In one photo of the basement stairs, there was a cloudy white image in the upper right-hand corner. When an officer enlarged the photo, that cloud appeared to resemble a face. The enlargement also revealed a second, greenish image that police say looked like a female form. The Gary police captain said photos he snapped with his cell phone also seemed to have strange silhouettes in them. The radio in his police-issued Ford malfunctioned on the way home. Later that night, the garage at his Gary home refused to open, even though the power was on everywhere else. On the way home that night, the driver's seat in his car had also started to move backward and forward on its own. When he took it into the dealership, the mechanic told him the motor on the driver's seat was broken, which could have caused an accident. The dealer told him he was very lucky indeed. In April of 2012, DCS petitioned Lake Juvenile Court for temporary wardship of the 3 Ammons children. The request was granted. An investigation had found that Latoya had neglected her children's education by not having them in school regularly. The finding was not just a symptom of the events on Carolina Street. Records showed that the same situation had been recorded in 2009, 2 years before the family had moved into the so-called demon house. The older children were sent to St. Joseph's Carmelite home in neighboring East Chicago, while the younger child was sent to another live-in facility for psychiatric evaluation. There, a clinical psychologist found him stable and coherent, except when he talked about demons. It was only then that his talk, the doctor said, became illogical. He tended to change the subject, and his stories varied each time he was asked about the events in the house. The doctor believed the 8-year-old did not suffer from a true psychotic disorder. She wrote in her report that the case was one of, quote, delusion instilled in the boy by his mother. The psychologist at St. Joseph's had the same diagnosis. Latoya had presumably influenced the older children into believing the family was possessed. The recommendations set by the Department of Children's Services included a stipulation that discussion of demons and being possessed not be a part of their conversations. They were also instructed to see therapists on a regular basis. Interestingly, Latoya was also instructed to find work and other housing, quote, due to the paranormal activity, end quote, at the current house, where police and DCS officials continued to investigate. Rosa, Latoya, and the 3 officers from the initial visit returned to the house on May 10, 2012. They were joined by Father Maginot, 2 Lake County police officers with a police dog to help determine whether a body might be buried there, and a different DCS caseworker who had volunteered to take the original worker's place because she didn't want to go back to the house. The group went down to the basement, where the caseworker saw a peculiar substance dripping from the wall. Touching it, the group found it to be slippery and tacky. Father Maginot told police he wanted to investigate the dirt floor under the stairs for either a human body or a pentagram or personal objects buried there, which could indicate a curse and consequently a demonic presence, possibly in the house. Part of his search was based on a recent series of strange visits from Latoya's boyfriend, which had led Father Maginot to believe that he had possibly placed a curse on the family. The Catholic Church does believe in curses, not just the power of suggestion, and a crucial part of placing a curse is the so-called cursed object, a piece of clothing, hair, eyeglasses, jewelry, photograph, or some other item which acts as a conduit for the intention of the curser. In an interview with the National Catholic Register, Father Maginot was later asked whether he believed Latoya's boyfriend had anything to do with the incidents at the house. He responded thus: "Maybe he put a curse on the mother. He had once asked her for an article of underwear as a souvenir. Around that time, Latoya also had a family picture disappear from her album, and a pair of her shoes disappeared as well. Personal items are often used in curses against a person. Latoya received an angry phone call from a woman who said she was the boyfriend's wife. Latoya said she never knew he was married and was going to break up with him anyway. The lady warned her that she was going to be very sorry that she ever had anything to do with him." The day the group returned to the house, police said the dirt area looked like the concrete might have been removed specifically to bury something. And with this added information, they began to dig. Removing a 4-foot portion of earth, the group found a press-on fingernail, a sock, a political button, a pair of boys' socks with the feet cut out, a lid for a pan, and a pair of underwear. Also among the items was a heavy weight of unknown origin or use, which the group thought might be connected to foul play or accidental death that may have occurred in the house, especially since the youngest boy was experiencing an imaginary friend who claimed to have been killed. At Maginot's instruction, the officer shoveled the dirt back in, and the priest sprinkled the area with blessed salt. Back upstairs, the caseworker and Latoya began to complain of maladies. Latoya felt an intense pain in her head, and the caseworker soon complained of pain in her finger. The skin on her digit had turned pale and felt tingly, as if it were being constricted. She then said that she was having a panic attack and needed to go outside. She ran out, the door slamming behind her, while the others stayed to continue their investigation of the house. It was at this time that they noticed the same slippery substance dripping from the blinds in a bedroom. More than a month earlier, Latoya and her mother had blessed the doors and windows with olive oil at the suggestion of a church worker, but the oil never dried and almost seemed to increase in substance and quantity. Unable to determine the source of it, they wiped it off and closed the door to the room to see if it would reappear. When they returned, about a half hour later, the substance was back. Father Maginot told the officers that such unknown substances were often found as a physical manifestation of demonic possession. It was this manifestation, on the heels of all he'd seen and heard, that led Father Maginot to write to Bishop Dale Meltzer and request permission to perform an exorcism. Maginot attests that the Bishop of Gary had never sanctioned an exorcism in the diocese during his more than 2 decades of service in this position. True to form, the bishop denied Maginot's plea as well, directing him to seek the guidance of other priests who had performed exorcisms. Doing so, Maginot said his advisors told him to perform a minor exorcism on Latoya, a deliverance. He arranged to perform a series of powerful blessings on the house and then to perform the minor ritual on Latoya. The case manager and 2 police officers attended the deliverance rite, during which the caseworker claimed to feel something unseen in the room. That same caseworker told a reporter that problems attended her constantly everywhere she went since becoming involved in the case. In a few weeks, she was burned in a motorcycle accident, broke her ribs jet skiing, and broke her hand and an ankle in separate incidents. Cryptically, Maginot gave Latoya an important directive: to identify the names of the demons who had been attacking her family. In an exorcism, it is very important for the identity of the demon or demons to be revealed. Maginot told Latoya to think about the things that the demon or demons had done and to find their names based on the harm they had caused her and her family. Latoya claimed that while she searched the internet for such names, the computer kept freezing and turning itself off, something that had never happened before, and that she felt nauseous and dizzy during these searches. But she persevered, eventually finding names which felt right to her, she said, including the names of demons assigned to harm children. After hearing the names, Father Maginot revealed to Latoya that he had received the bishop's permission to exorcise her with the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. 3 major exorcisms were required to complete what Father Maginot set out to do. The first 2 were performed in English, the third in Latin. In attendance were 2 of the police officers who had been involved in the case since the first home visit, to offer both emotional and physical support in case the superhuman strength common in exorcisms became an issue. During the first 2 exorcisms, Latoya convulsed and thrashed, falling asleep at times, which Father Maginot believed was a way for the demons to lessen the power of the ritual. But the hold seemed to lessen by the end of the second attempt, after which Father Maginot went on retreat to refresh himself for the final confrontation. Father Maginot would later confide to me how he knew the first exorcism wasn't successful, although Latoya seemed to settle into peace at the end of it. The team was hopeful that Ammons' troubles were at an end, and they wished her well and went home. Father Maginot stayed and gave Latoya some rosary beads and told her he would be in touch, advising her to say the rosary every day. Ammons left to drive home, and Maginot finished closing up the church. Out in the parking lot, he made his way to his car, which had been parked right next to that of Latoya's, now gone. On the ground next to his car, the priest found the rosary beads he'd given her, ripped apart, torn to bits. By the time of the final exorcism, in June of 2012, the police no longer came. Father Maginot asked his brother to assist. After some minor convulsions during the event, Latoya fell asleep. This would be the end of her possession. Latoya Ammons regained custody of her children in the fall of 2012, taking them to their new home in Indianapolis, where she'd moved with her mother during the DCS investigation. I talked with Father Maginot in the spring of 2015, 3 years after the events in the Ammons house. I had contracted to write a book about the ghosts and hauntings of Gary, Indiana with History Press, and it was right during this time that the story of the demon house came out and the purchasing of the house by Ghost Adventures' Zak Bagans, of which more in a moment. Father Maginot was not the appointed exorcist of the Diocese of Gary when he found himself ministering to the troubled family of Latoya Ammons. In fact, there was no exorcist. But like most priests, he was no stranger to the paranormal. He had done many house blessings for people who had disturbances in their homes, and many priests perform a surprising number of these blessings to quell certain kinds of activity, especially encountered in homes after deaths or after moves or remodels. Father Maginot doesn't typically see spirits when he finds himself in these kinds of cases, but this time, the case of the house on Carolina Street, he says that was different. And this is a quote from him. It was things Latoya and her mother were telling me that would happen in the house. And then when I was there, they would happen too. I would witness them. I knew these things had something to do with Latoya's ex-boyfriend. Something struck me strange about him. Whenever I would talk about him, things would happen. And I thought, what is the involvement here? Who is involved here? The children? But then when I would press this crucifix to Latoya's forehead and she would begin to convulse, I would know it was actually about her. Father Maginot and I talked about the popular perception of exorcisms and possession seen in The Exorcist and other films. But he said this case, too, was different. He said, you normally think it's something you brought on yourself, a Ouija board, some occult thing. But when it was shown that this was something that happened to the family, we were baffled. Latoya was never involved in the occult, never dabbled in anything, but I did think something was brought in with the boyfriend. The last time he was there, things had gone up to a level where it almost drove them out of the house. I just want to interject here. There was occult activity by Latoya when she was responding to what was first going on in the house. Remember, she brought in these occult people, clairvoyants, mediums, different shady ministers. She smudged the house. So there was definitely some occult stuff that she brought in herself. So I just wanted to interject that. Latoya had been seeing this man for some time when she discovered that he was married. She broke it off, but he continued to pursue her, even finding out the location of her new home on Carolina Street and showing up at the door, sometimes trying to see the children while Latoya was at work. Now, Latoya had found about the man's wife from the wife, who called her one afternoon to confront her. Latoya was dumbfounded. She didn't know that the boyfriend was married. She assured the woman she wanted nothing to do with an adulterer. But before she could hang up on this woman, Latoya heard the woman's last words to her, "You will regret ever messing with my husband." Now, few people, not even Catholics themselves, are aware that the church really does believe in the reality of curses. And it's not just the power of suggestion. This is what a lot of psychologists and anthropologists think, right? That when someone's doing voodoo or something like that, it's the power of suggestion. This is not what the church believes. The church does concede that that can't happen, of course. But the Catholic Church also does believe in the reality of someone being able to call down the power of demons to curse someone, to bring trouble to someone, or to do good, alleged good, right? Not God's will, but their own will or someone else's will. So there is that belief that families can be actually and deeply affected by these powerful forces that are deliberately affixed to them or sent to them to wreak havoc on their lives. We do have communities and beliefs and religions that do believe this. You think about like ancestor worship. I've written about how the Black Lives Matter movement does these rituals where they think they're calling up the spirits of the dead to protest with them, fight their battles with them, do things for them. They're not calling up the deceased. They're spirits that appear, but they are not the spirits of the deceased. So it's demons alone who are sort of on call for the whims of the living to serve the living. And if a person or family doesn't have a firm foothold in prayer and faith life, they're distracted by a lot of problems, struggling to live, traumatized by something, or even physically debilitated by, like, for example, living in poverty, not having heat, not having food, not having enough money to pay the bills. This can really open up the doors for these demonic influences to come into the family. So crucial to the curse is a cursed object. And you might know this from witchcraft, right? You need a piece of hair, a photograph of the person, a piece of clothing, a ring, eyeglasses, some intimate object that's inextricably connected to the target of the curse. And it's this object over which the curse is made. And in the case of the Ammons family, there were many possibilities. Father Maginot told me, and this is a quote, "We felt there must be some sort of curse because there were many things that were strange. The first time the boyfriend moved in with her, he asked for her underwear." This is Latoya. She asked, "What for?" He told her it was to remember the wonderful moment or some such thing. But also at that time, and she never thought about it until much later, she was missing a pair of Air Jordans, sneakers, expensive shoes she had bought, and it was a big deal. And she thought one of the kids took them or was wearing them or had messed them up and had hid them, but they never could find them. Also around the same time, Latoya wanted to have a family picture in the living room, and she was looking through the stack of pictures she had and saw that this photo and photos of the kids and such were missing. She never found where those pictures were, end quote. I also asked Father Maginot what he and the police and the social worker found under the stairs when they dug under the dirt floor and what he thought it all meant. And he said he believed that some of these things might have been a part of necromancy to conjure up the dead. And he felt they were not related to the Ammons case, but likely the reason for the family feeling there were ghosts in the house, that there were these evil spirits that were pretending to be the spirit of this boy that had been killed or something like that. I also wondered to Father Maginot if he had experienced any residue himself. I asked him if maybe some entity was making itself known to him in the rectory or in his church. And he shared this story with me. He said after the exorcism and also toward the end of it, at our parish, we had several storms come through at that time when the last exorcism had been done. One was after Mass on Sunday, and it knocked out all the lights in the church. But they were able to get the lights back on. The second time was the longest, around the 4th of July. This was right around the time of the final exorcism. We were doing the exorcism in the church, and Latoya's mouth was moving, but no words were coming out. And then the lights went out. Later, she told me that she was trying to tell me that something was trying to lift her up off the chair. The demon may have been trying to gather the energy to do that using the energy from the lights. This is what Father Maginot said. But they weren't able to do it, he said, because they were in the church. So the demon wasn't able to gather that much power. So he told me after the 4th of July, we had another storm come in and it knocked out the power for more than a day. It was about 90 degrees at the church and my rectory was horrible, trying to sleep at about 85 degrees at night. But then they got the power back on about 30 hours later. Then another storm came and knocked out the power in the church again. We had Mass by candlelight and we brought out these candelabras and lit all the candles. That was beneficial because the week after that, right in the middle of Mass, the power went out again. And so we brought in the candelabras and lit them again without missing a beat. We never had a loss of power like that. Never. And he found that this was unique to their experiences at the church. This had not been going on at houses or businesses in the surrounding area. It was just on their property. Not long after Marissa Kwiatkowski's story broke in the paper, the house on Carolina Street was purchased by Zak Bagans, the star of the immensely popular Travel Channel series Ghost Adventures. Bagans, who now lives in Las Vegas, began as a film student and ended up, as you may know, as a celebrity when his 2004 documentary about a team of 3 ghost hunters, including himself, became an overnight sensation. So he formed together with Nick Groff and Aaron Goodwin, and he has filmed, I think it's like 20 seasons of Ghost Adventures and counting. And he's now the executive producer of the show. He enjoys the adoration of millions of fans around the world, and he runs this haunted museum in Las Vegas that has all of these artifacts from cases that he's worked on at very haunted places and other dark objects. A lot of weird stuff in the museum. In 2014, Zak announced that he'd been living in the house on Carolina Street and filming a documentary about the house and the case. So he had purchased the house, the demon house. I think it was for like $25,000 or $30,000. And apparently he had moved into the place and was doing investigations there. And he was so impressed by what he found there that he was making a full documentary about it, a film. Now, I've worked with Zak Bagans on several occasions, and at the time this was announced, I was working on this book, right, about haunted Gary, Indiana, and I had written this whole thing about the demon house story that had come out in the paper. So when I found out that Zak had purchased the house, I contacted a good friend of mine. You may know him, Jeff Belanger. He has been the historian and writer of the show for like almost since the beginning. And I was like, wow, I see Zak bought this house in Gary, Indiana, this so-called demon house, and I'm writing a book on haunted Gary, and I would love to talk to him about it. So I had worked with Zak on Ghost Adventures. I had worked on a show called Paranormal Challenge with Zak. So I knew Zak and he knew me. We weren't like friends or anything, but I asked Jeff, like, hey, can you ask Zak if he can give me a call, or if I can just interview him or ask him a few questions about his time with the house or why he bought it, whatever. Just wanted a quote for the book, right? Nope. Wouldn't talk to me, wouldn't respond, not one word. Would not talk about it. Later, as you may know, Bagans would have the house bulldozed suddenly without any warning. Before doing that, he removed the basement stairs and some other artifacts from the house. I think things from the makeshift altar that Latoya had built to try and quell this activity. And he installed these things in his haunted museum attraction in Las Vegas, where I'm sorry, Zak, you shouldn't go there. There's a lot of evil stuff there, a lot of cursed objects, very bad things there. Now, this may be controversial, but I really felt there were a lot of strange developments that seemed to come from the people that were brought to this house during Zak's investigations and afterwards, and the filming of this documentary. Let me tell you a little bit about people I know that were involved in this. Two good friends. One is a former Gary police officer, and one is a longtime paranormal investigator and documentary filmmaker, also from the area. They were the first people to offer investigative services to the family during the time before the events had escalated and long before the story broke in the paper. So he had actually been a police officer in Gary and was a seasoned paranormal investigator, along with his friend and partner in ghost hunting. They offered their services. For some reason, Latoya said, no, thank you. So next was a dear friend of mine, Bob Jensen, who recently passed away. He's the founder of Ghostland Society and has done literally thousands of investigations, one of the oldest and most experienced paranormal investigators in the entire Chicago area. And also very low key. He just knows what he's doing, and he did a lot of investigations and really also very down to earth. Not a religious person, like a very scientific minded person. He and his team traveled to the house on 3 separate occasions. They said they found no evidence whatsoever of paranormal activity. I asked Bob why they kept going back, and he explained that it was the team's standard practice when children were involved to make many visits to make absolutely sure there was no danger to the family. And I think they made a total of 6 visits to the house. I also had friends, David Scott and John B. Stevens, who had the paranormal research group called IPRA Strong. And they, as some of you may know, are videographers. They had a long-time internet show called Believe, an online paranormal experience. And they went to the house after reading the story in the Indy Star because they wanted to try to speak to the current owners and hopefully investigate the house. No one seemed to be at home, but they took some film footage, and they also recorded for voice phenomena, EVP, using a so-called ghost box, a ghost radio. Now, you guys have heard me talk against communication till I'm blue in the face. I used to do this all the time. I was really good at it. This is something we should not be doing as Christians. Expressly told in the Bible, my God, not to try and communicate with spirits. And spirits of the dead do not talk to us. So if you are getting messages from spirits, it is not deceased humans, and you don't want these messages. But that said, they did use this ghost box and they got messages. One of the investigators said, who possessed Latoya Ammons in the house. A male voice said, "I did." Voices also said there was a human buried in the house. Another voice said that the spirits in the house did not know Christ. So remember, again, these are not voices that are coming from humans. They're coming from demons, probably, or possibly from our subconscious mind or something like that. But you do not want to use these tools. But I did want to point this out because these tools do work. We don't know what these voices are, but we do know that they are not human spirits and we are not to speak to them. They're definitely not angels or saints. So don't use these tools. Now, I asked Father Maginot also in this interview I did with him, was he now the go-to exorcist for the Diocese of Gary? And has the church been slammed with requests for exorcisms since this story broke? And he said that, yes, there were a lot of people that had been coming forward that believed that they might need the help of a priest and things that were happening to them. In the fall of 2020, he told my friend Philip Potempo, who's a reporter for the Northwest Indiana Post-Tribune, he said, "We had a situation not too long ago where a family came to me and I performed my exorcism in the conference meeting room at the rectory. The demon left the body of the person, but we soon discovered it seemed to have inhabited a piece of furniture, an antique cabinet, which we never knew the history of or where it came from, and we had to remove it and destroy it." It was interesting. This reminded me of the case of Ronald Hunkler, the boy that was the inspiration for the book and film The Exorcist. According to one person who worked in the area, he said that when that exorcism was completed, the furniture from the exorcism room was blessed and it was locked up in a storage facility so that in case any of the demons that had been released had gone into any of the furniture, it would not be able to harm. These demons would not be able to go into anyone else. So it's interesting. This comes up from time to time, this idea that during exorcisms, the spirits might go into inanimate objects and kind of lie in wait, waiting to torment someone else. So I said I have a little controversial stuff about this to talk about, and you can take it with a grain of salt. No pun intended. Should do a whole show about why we talk about salt in the paranormal, because it comes up all the time in paranormal cases. Maybe I'll do that down the road. But many people that were involved in this case, like really bad things happened to them. And this is something that I've talked about in the past. I feel that it happened to me because of my association with places like Bachelor's Grove and Joliet Prison. And I've seen bad things happen to other people, very bad things happen to other people that had associations with those places. Illness, family problems, mental health issues, accidents, even death. And I just want to mention these things. So Father Maginot, he had health issues before. I'm not going to say he didn't, but he had ended up having his leg amputated. And when I went to contact him, I just want to kind of catch up with him. And I think last year we were going to have an event and I wanted to invite him. There was a message on the diocese board online that said that Father Maginot was not allowed to work on exorcism cases or to discuss the procedure anymore. So I don't know what happened, nothing that I know of, but maybe it was because of the sensationalism and the media stuff and the films and everything around the case. Maybe the bishop felt that was not in the best interest of the church or for other possible possession victims or other demonic influence victims. But at any rate, he had his leg amputated, and this work that he was doing that I think he really felt he was called to, he's now apparently been cut off from doing. My friend who visited the house those half dozen times to investigate, and he said he found nothing there, was stricken in recent years with a brain tumor that was inexplicable, according to the doctors, and he passed away recently. And, in the last conversations that he and I had were about this very thing that, maybe we have gotten a lot of physical and mental problems from being around these places for so many years. And that's kind of what I'm getting at here. There's another medium, longtime psychic medium, and we've talked about mediumship and how dangerous that is, and how these are not human spirits that are speaking. And uh, tragically, so many people are quick to say mediums are frauds. I'm not quick to say mediums are frauds. I have many very dear friends who call themselves psychic mediums over the years, still do. And I think many of these people really believe they are legitimately receiving messages from deceased humans. They're not. But it's very tragic, and it's a terrible situation. And I think all these years of influence really do take a toll on many of these people in a very real way. And one of these mediums in recent years was also suddenly diagnosed with a very rare form of cancer. And I just thought, wow, that person was actually part of the Demon House case, apparently. Someone that Zak had brought in. Dr. Barry Taff, prominent parapsychologist, one of the most prominent, well-known, respected parapsychologists, was brought into this case by Zak. He appears in the film. He returned home after visiting the house, and one by one, his organs started to shut down. And he had so many medical issues and bills that he ended up literally homeless. This esteemed scientist. You may know from Ghost Adventures, Mark and Debbie Constantino. This was a celebrity husband and wife EVP research team, so specializing in spirit communication. They were found dead, as you may know, in a murder-suicide in Sparks, Nevada in 2015. They had a lot of marital problems. I know when they came to speak at our events in Chicago, they were constantly arguing in the hotel. A lot of people staying there that came to our event said how worried they were about them because you could hear them screaming at each other in their hotel room down the hallway. Apparently, voices in the demon house called out the names of Mark and Debbie during the investigations that were done there. And Zak talked about the relationship between the house and Mark and Debbie as well in some of the episodes. But those episodes, I guess, have been removed from circulation. So I wasn't able to pinpoint that. So, don't quote me on this, but there are people talking about this in this episode. The demon house was brought up with Mark and Debbie, or, whatever. If you saw the documentary, The Demon House, that Zak eventually released, you know that the last night he stayed in the house when he was locked and he was boarded up in the house by himself, something happened where there's this bright flash of light or energy, and it permanently affected his eyesight. So now he wears these prism glasses because he's got this permanent double vision. I can't remember the name of the malady specifically, but yeah, he wears these glasses because of something that apparently happened that last night in the house. So there are a lot of strange things that are not publicly talked about this case. A lot of people just blow it off. Netflix has this movie that came out. It stars Glenn Close, called The Deliverance. And it was supposedly based on the Demon House case. All I read was that Netflix bought this movie for like $64 million or something, or bought the story. And I was like, whoa. I was looking forward to it. I thought it was going to be a really intense documentary or a dramatized version of it. And I was looking forward to seeing it. And it was absolutely horrible. I'm going to do like a review of this movie, and I'll post it, of course, on this channel because it's just so bad. It's like one of this new wave of movies that look at possession as like some like new agey thing. We'll talk about that more. But at any rate, I recognize in this case, as far as the subtlety of what the devil does in these places and across different people's lives, different people's families that are involved in them, whether it's mental health issues, family issues, issues with financial stuff, physical health. And I just find it very insidious in many ways. And so a lot of people kind of dismiss this as this isn't real. This was a fraud. This was a fake. This wasn't proven. There's no evidence. But I think sometimes when you look at these cases, the real evidence plays out over many different people and many different families. And I think that's definitely the case here. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Uncanny Catholic, and I hope you do come back. Check out the dramatized version of the Demon House story in the link below. And I hope to see you next time right here on Uncanny Catholic. And until then, remember to pray for everyone involved in the Demon House case, and especially that family of Latoya Ammons, and pray for Exorcist Father Michael Maginot. And until next time, remember to pray for ghosts. I'm Ursula Bielski. See you next time. Bye.